Hi, folks, from November Echo 5 Victor.
Thank you all for coming and welcome to the first CQ Blind Hams Tech Zoom, January 2023. We get together every month to talk about all kinds of neat technology, ham radio related stuff, all of course from the blind perspective. You can find out more about this podcast as well as many other things that Blind Hams are up to by going to www.blindhams.com. So just to get this out of the way, for those who may be new and don't come here regularly, this is obviously being recorded. It is going to become a podcast, and a very special one this time. So it's not just a podcast. This one has a very special purpose as well. So the bottom line is, if you don't want to have your voice on the recording, then I guess keep muted for the entirety. So, of course, when this thing's being recorded, something's going to pop up on your screen telling you that you're being recorded. You got to hit got it. Otherwise, you won't be able to access your meeting controls. So what we ask is, of course, that ideally that we wait to be acknowledged before speaking so that we don't have people talking over each other. That way it keeps everything nice and clean. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the crew here of the CQ Blind Hams podcast, but we're going to do it a little differently this time because this particular meeting is in memory of Chris Miller, NE5V, November Echo 5 Victor. Many of us know his voice from many things he does on Blind Hams. Unfortunately, we lost him toward the end of last year, and it has absolutely left a void in our community as far as I'm concerned. So the idea is that we wanted to get together and have a meeting to just sort of memorialize him, to share stories and things that he has done for each and every one of us on the Blind Hams community, because he has certainly helped and elmered a lot of people. This is, in addition to being a podcast, is also going to be sent to his wife, Claudia, so that she can hear for herself just how much Chris was admired and appreciated by all of us. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to introduce the crew here. And I guess maybe for starters, when I introduce each one of you, maybe you can go ahead and tell a little something of what you know about Chris, or some little memory or way that he helped you, if you want to share that with everybody. So we're going to go ahead and start with Joel, W0CAS.
Thank you, Julian. Yeah, this is a tough one, especially for a lot of us that knew Chris for a long time. I didn't know him, but I didn't have the pleasure, but to know him for about 4 years when he started checking on Saturday morning net when I was net control and managed the net control duties. And Chris was always around to help me out with questions about different things, DMR back then, and then got into All-Star. And but you said a lot of us knew his voice. My wife knew Chris by his laugh and by his attitude about how he enjoyed what he was doing. And I'd be talking to him and he'd be cutting up and laughing and doing his puns. And my wife says, that's that Chris down in Texas, right? I said, yeah. She said, I know his laugh. And we really, really miss Chris's laugh, and just want everybody. And Chris, once I passed over the duties to net control to Robert, and then Robert passed it over to Chris, and Chris took it off and ran with it, and showed us what a net control manager is supposed to be around the Blind Hams group. So anyway, back to you, Julian.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. I couldn't agree with you more. That laugh of his, it was absolutely just unique and very expressive. I used to love just listening to him laugh, as well as give all the helpful bits of knowledge and information that he shared over the years. So let's see, Robert, NC5R, any words?
Yeah, good evening, Joel. Good evening, Joel and Julian, and everybody else on the Zoom meeting. This is Robert, NC5R. I knew of Chris for a long time because he used to be involved in the Texas traffic net on 40 meters, the 7290 Texas traffic net for many, many years, and I used to listen to that net and occasionally check into it back in the 90s. But I didn't actually get to know Chris personally until I came on the Blind Hams bridge, and I just got to the point where whenever I would hear that NE5 Victor, NE5V call, I just start to smile because Chris just had such a gentle, caring, lovely way about him that just would kind of light up the bridge, in my opinion. When he came on, he was more than willing to help anyone. He became quite an all-star, and I guess in general, digital mode expert. He learned an awful lot about it, and helped so many of us with All Star. And I remember when I first came on and was thinking needed to SSH into my node, and I was afraid to do it. And then Chris began to refer to anytime we would talk. At first, he would say, "Here's the guy who's having to deal with the dreaded SSH." Back to you, Julian.
Yes, he certainly played a role in getting me to eventually get into playing with SSH a little bit. So absolutely. Steve in New York, WB2KTV, what say you?
Oh, good evening, everybody. I met Chris on the radio in 2019. I got into DMR a little bit when the GD77S first came out. And then when I learned about All-Star and how horrible I sounded on DMR, I built my All-Star node. But before that was after that happened, rather, and I finally got onto All-Star, I got to talk with Chris Moore, and he came out with a podcast that really intrigued me. It was how to put a piece of firmware on a radio I didn't yet own that would turn everything on the screen, instead of turning it into English speech or any other language speech for that matter, it would send it out in Morse code. And I thought, what a novel idea. I've got to try this. I listened to his podcast. I implemented the instructions in his podcast, and I was an instant fan. Every time he came out with another podcast, whether I needed it or not, I would listen attentively, try and adopt what he said, take it to heart so that I could pass it on. I passed a lot of his podcasts on to other people, and they all found them very helpful. Chris also was able to find and redistribute, I guess is the best way to put it, radios people didn't want or didn't need anymore because they've moved on to something bigger and better for themselves. And I got a friend of mine in Hawaii a radio from Chris that he programmed up and sent to her so that all she had to do was open the box, put an antenna on it, and she was on the air. And that's WH6EYV, Kau in Hawaii. And she still uses that radio to this day and also remembers Chris very well. And two other quick things I remember about Chris that aren't him related. He was a violinist. Now, he would say he was a fiddle player. I never heard him play, so I don't know what the difference between a violinist and a fiddle player is. I guess to me, a violinist is a fiddle player with a lot of instruction, maybe a degree behind him. But he always used to talk about his band and his recordings, and I'm sorry I never got to hear any. But one thing, you put Chris and I on a channel, and we start with our puns and forget it. We could just feed off on each other with those puns for hours on end. and I really miss that about him. Anyway, thanks for letting me talk about him. And back to you, Julian from WB2KTV.
Oh, thanks, Steve. Yeah, I think I managed to catch one or two of those sessions of yours with the puns, and that was funny stuff, that's for sure. And I agree, as far as the music. I didn't know that Chris was a musician, at least on that level, until much later. And I wish that I had known that side of him a little bit more. So next, usually a guy that's behind the scenes, making sure all the levels are right and everything's going according to the way that it should for these recordings. But I'm going to see if Angelo, N2DYN, wants to step in here a little bit and see if he's got something he wants to share about Chris.
Well, I'll keep it brief. Chris was a very good violin fiddle player, excellent. And Chris, he had such a caring heart that even at the end there, like a week before he was passing, he called me up to ask me to help finish a project that he was working on for this guy to get his DMR equipment going. I mean, at that time of your life, to reach out and care about somebody else tells you the kind of man he was. A beautiful soul that man had. Back to you, Julian, and thanks a lot.
Oh, thanks, Angelo, and I agree. I remember hearing those conversations there toward the end, and normally someone facing what he was facing would have pretty much been just shut down, I guess, for lack of a better term. But what I heard from him always was, on one hand, he understood what he was facing, but on the other hand, I think that he conveyed the feeling that he, as long as he had an ounce of energy in him, he was not just going to lay down and wait for the end to come. Even till the end, he was doing what he does best, and that was helping people. So that leads to me. My name is Julian. My call sign's N1CA, November 1, Charlie Alpha. And I came on the scene here with Blind Hams, around 2020, shortly after the COVID lockdowns, and when I got into DMR and started reaching out, ways to connect with other people during times that we had to kind of stop our social lives from happening. And one thing led to another, and I wound up on the Brandmeister talk group for Blind Hams, and I met all of you. And Chris particularly, I didn't have the same length of history that some of y'all have had with him, but even in the short time that I knew him, he absolutely left an impression. As far as help that he personally gave me, the only thing I could think of off the bat is shortly after the GD77S, no, I'm sorry, the GD77 became accessible with Roger Clark software. I had already had the 77S program on my computer and had the JAWS scripts, that worked with that. And of course, the CPS for the GD77 very much resembles that of the 77S, but of course it's a different program technically. So I was trying to figure out, and at the time they didn't have JAWS scripts, at least that I knew of, specifically for that one, but there were the ones for the 77S. And I was asking around, and Chris Miller helped me to figure out how to go in there and rename some files. So basically JAWS could read or apply the scripts to the software that programmed the GD77, and I can keep using it the same way that I was used to. So that was tremendously helpful to me. I learned a lot also just from hearing him help other people, and not just from the information that he gave, but his style of helping people as a trainer and someone who presents information about mobile access technology. Particularly, I'm always teaching people. People are always coming to me with questions, and it's people like Chris who I learn from, because I apply their style to how I teach people and work with people, because of how patient he was, how jolly he was when he did it. You know, he helped you, but he never made you feel like a dummy because you dared to ask something that you didn't know. He helped you, and he did it with a smile, and he made you feel good about yourself when it was all said and done. So I think there was one net of the Visual Inconvenience Hams net that they did right around Christmas time, and I think it was in 2020, if I'm not mistaken, where they had a voice of Santa Claus, and I believe that Chris was the one who stepped up and did that one year. So that was kind of fun, and boy, he certainly had the right voice for being Santa, that's for sure. Not to mention the personality and the attitude and just everything that went with it. And I have to say the airwaves are not quite as vibrant, not quite the same, without hearing his voice come on saying NE5V. So I will always miss him, but I think his spirit, what he wanted to do for others, his willingness and desire to teach, to help, and just be part of this vibrant community, that lives on through all of us, and we'll all keep doing that as we move forward and continue what he did best, and that's help and Elmer and make people laugh and all that other fine stuff in the middle. And yeah, even those who got to hear it, who got to enjoy his violin playing too, you know, it just always all around pleasure, and he will absolutely be missed. So that's it for our host, but someone who normally isn't on these meetings with us very often, but is very much a vital part of the Blind Hams Network, is Patrick, N2DYI. So I thought I'd kick it over to Patrick and see if Patrick had any thoughts or memories or stories he wanted to share.
Oh, thanks, Julian. I definitely do. This is N2DYI. And before I get into my main point, let me just say something that is very cliche and something that kind of just in itself reminds me of Chris. I would not be the man I am today without the influence of NE5V. Now, I have a very good reason for saying that. I'm not just saying it. I have a very good reason for it. So let me explain. So I met Chris, like a lot of you, in 2019. I know some of you have known him a lot longer than I did. I met him through the Blind Hams mailing list just prior to when I actually got on the Blind Hams talk group when it was Brandmeister only. I posted some questions about the MD380, which is the radio Steve was talking about a few minutes ago. I had just bought one, and I was kind of in the process of learning how DMR worked. I basically took a crash course in DMR and learned, pretty much went from nothing to having a pretty good idea of how things should have worked in about a day. I bought a hotspot and a radio, and I figured out how to do all the firmware stuff. But there were a few questions I had, and Chris helped me with that, and that's how we got introduced. But then later, after I had known him for a while and gotten more and more involved with the Blind Hams network, and Chris was one of the first people I convinced to buy an All-Star node. He was kind of my test case. Hey, if Chris can tell people, this is kind of how this is sort of how I looked at it. If Chris NE5V can get people to get into All-Star, my job is done, because he was so good at explaining how things worked and so good at helping other people get into whatever he was interested in. And I just kind of threw it at him and said, "Here, have fun, have a project," and he ran with it, like he did with everything that I know him for anyway. So much later, and yes, we had pun fests as well, usually not on the air, but on phone calls and WhatsApp and things like that. Chris and I, reminds me a lot of my granddad in that way. He was also a very punny guy. But much later, we were talking about call signs, and I told Chris, I'm a 4 in 2 land, and that feels really weird to me. I never thought it would bother me. I was KE4DYI, got my call sign in 1993, and just thought, well, I'm never going to change my call. It's my identity. It's who I am. But I like the DYI part. But the more I was on the air, active in New York City, the weirder it felt for me to be a 4. And it shouldn't, these days it really doesn't matter. You can have 1s in California, Julian looking at you, 0s in Tennessee, Joel, how you doing? It really doesn't matter. But it just felt weird to me. And I was talking to Chris, and he said, "Hey, N2DYI is available. You should get it." And I was like, "Really?" For whatever reason, I never looked that one up, so I did. I got it, and so that's one way to honor his memory. Is it's his fault that I have the call sign that I have today. So there's my Chris Miller story, and NE5V definitely will be missed. The airwaves just aren't the same without you, man. That's what I got. Back to you, Julian.
Absolutely. And that's funny that you mentioned about me being a 1 in 6 line. I actually started out with a 6 call, then I went to a 2 call, and ended up with a 1 call as a vanity, as a gift to myself for making extra. So that's a story there. All right. So as far as a list that I had here, that was it. But now I figure we could open it up. I know there's a lot of other people who are on here as well, and might want to do the same, share a story or a memory. So if you don't mind, just one at a time, just somebody state your name or call sign or something, and I'll call you, and then you can go ahead and say what you have to say.
W5 MRR, I'll stick that in there.
All right, Marvin, go for it.
Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. And for those who may not know me, I'm W5 MRR Marvin in Southwest Louisiana. And I've known Chris 39 years. I was raised in West Texas and went to Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas. And at the time, Chris was working full-time for a small radio station in Brownfield, Texas, and playing in a band. He had a band called the Chris Miller Band. And somewhere, I don't even remember, and I wish Chris were here because he could tell me. And I was involved. That's the funny part. Anyway, they were playing in Lubbock somewhere. And so I happened to be there that night. And they were doing the sound checks and all this stuff. And I went up when they were in the middle of the sound check, and I said, "Look, you need to turn thus and such up and thus and such down and do this, that, and the other to make your sound better." So they went through that thing, and probably about a week later, I got a phone call from Chris, and he said, "Look, we really need a good sound engineer. Would you be interested?" And so that's kind of how Chris and I met. He, of course, already had his ham ticket, had the NE5V as his call. And I knew from the time I was a kid, I wanted to get my ham ticket. And so there was a built-in mentor for me. And he encouraged me. And every time when I was having trouble with CW and I hit that 10 or 11 word a minute hump, he kept encouraging me and saying, "All right, come on. Let's get on the air." We'd get on 75 meters at night in the CW section of the band when I had my novice and tech ticket. And we'd get on there, and he would be so patient about and he told me, he said, "Why don't you just make one CW contact a day and you'll get your ticket?" Because I had already taken the CW test and flunked the heck out of it. But I did that. I went home. I said, all right, I'll do that. And then that turned into 2 or 3 contacts a day. So I had the pleasure of Chris being my ham radio mentor and working with a band for about 5 years before I left Texas Tech and came to Louisiana to teach school. And because of ham radio and the band, Chris and I never lost contact. In fact, well, when Chris got married the first time, he and I married 2 girls that were best friends, and both of us ended up in divorce court. But he was the only guy I ever knew that had a wedding on 40 meters. And he worked with that. Somebody mentioned about the 7290 traffic net. He maintained their database right up until he couldn't anymore. So I have lots of Chris Miller music and recordings and things that I recorded back there in the 80s. Things that right now I don't think I could listen to. Not even, I don't think I could listen to the podcast yet. And I know they're there, and thanks to Joel and Julian and a bunch of other folks out there, they'll be here. And that I am very, very happy for, because some of those things are going to be relevant for a long time. And that's it. I could go on for a long time, but I'll shut up. And thanks, guys, for hosting this thing. And that's all I got. Back to Julian.
Wow, thank you, Marvin. That's quite a story. So far, those of us that spoke are people that came across Chris when we were hams already. So it was really neat to hear that story from you, who was actually truly Elmered by him from the start and brought into the hobby. So that is really cool. That must have been quite fun having him be your ham teacher of sorts. Anybody else want to share something?
Julian. Hey, Julian, this is Dennis, WR5 Delta Charlie.
Go ahead, Dennis.
Okay, thanks, Julian, and good evening to everybody. This is Dennis, as I said, WR5DC. I check into the nets most of the time when I'm around, but anyway, my time goes back with Chris quite a ways. I would say about the only one that I've known longer than Chris is probably Marvin. And we go back about 30 years. And gosh, I've known Chris for probably at least 25, maybe longer. But, we had a group we have a group on 75 meters that gets on the radio every morning in the early morning. And Chris was an integral part of that group. And, he was in there every day. And it just one of those things that when you talk to somebody every single day for that many years, you're almost like family. And then, of course, Chris and I got into D-Star first. And Chris and I started talking about D-Star. It's been 10 years ago, I guess. And Chris and I got interested in D-Star, and we ended up buying one of those nano hotspots. And we worked together figuring all that kind of stuff out. And then I just kind of lost interest in it. And Chris just pressed on. But, I mean, he picked it up so quick that, he knew everything that was going on with it and was able to get it going. And probably for the last 2 years, once a week or every couple of times in a week, he would say, Dennis, you need to get on All-Star with us. And for 2 years, he pinged me, and finally I did it. And so I threw the towel in and said, okay, buddy, let's get after it. And we started in August. And of course, Raspberry Pis were tough to find, but I managed to find 2 or 3 Raspberry Pi 3s. And Chris took his image and made modifications to his image and put it on these, and there was very little tweaking that he had to do. I mean, I was just totally amazed at what he had learned from the time that he and I got into D-Star. He just passed me like a racehorse, and I was sitting still. But anyway, he got me all set up on D-Star and got me in with you guys. And normally in the mornings after everybody'd get tired of talking, we'd stay in there for a little while and talk about the All-Star and the digital modes. But I'll tell you what, I couldn't have gotten all this done and gotten these 3 nodes working had it not been for Chris and his mentoring. And oh my gosh, we just spent hours on the phone, getting this stuff working. And well, I'll tell you what, it just caught me as a shock when he found out his prognosis. And he's left a heck of a gap. I know with all you guys here, and he's left a big gap in the morning group on the guys that are on 3953 in the morning, because that's where a lot of the blind guys are. And there's just a bunch of them. That's kind of where they all congregate on 75 meters. But anyway, Julian, that's about all I have to say. Just boy, I miss him, and there's just a hole where that he's left, and what we've tried to do in ham radio. He's going to be missed and can't be replaced. WR5DC, thank you, gentlemen. I'm clear.
Thanks, Dennis. Yeah, I agree. Absolutely, a void left that can't easily be filled. That's for sure. All right. Anybody else?
NC5R with a comment.
All right. We got Hap Holly and Robert. So let me go ahead and get Robert in there first, because since you just had a comment, and then we'll go to Hap.
All right. So I think this fits well in here after Marvin and Dennis and Julian, you and people have talked about Chris's involvement with All-Star and everything. I got an email and was asked to read comments from Joe Stephen, VK7JS, who was not able to be here, but he asked me to read these comments. So this is from Joe. As the developer of accessible GD77 replacement firmware for several handheld amateur radios, I had the privilege and honor of working with Chris, who often provided me valuable test feedback. His feedback was always much appreciated. His contributions to amateur radio for the blind are significant and far-reaching. His contributions to the podcast have helped and will continue to help blind amateur into the future. He is already sorely missed. And that's from Joe Stephen. And I worked with Joe a lot on testing of the GD77 accessible firmware, of course, along with Chris and Neil and others. But that's a real contribution that Chris made. He spent hours beta testing that firmware and always came up with really important things that needed to be resolved and really creative ideas for how to make it all better. So I just wanted to share those comments that were sent by Joe. Back to you, Julian. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Robert. Yeah. Oh boy, I'm so glad that Joe chimed in there like that via the email. It's a little hard for him to be at these meetings given the extraordinary time difference that exists between here and Australia. So the one thing I can attest to that, or add to it, I should say, is that Chris did a lot of help with the GD77S part of things, which Admittedly, I'm one, and I think a lot of us probably went along the same lines as when this 77 came out. We were much more attracted to that radio because it had a keypad and gave us a lot more capability, things we can get at quicker than we could with what the fewer keys and options that were available with the 77S. But as we've heard, and especially from guys like Neil who had physical conditions, motor skill, the difficulties, the GD77S has turned out to be quite a lifesaver in some ways for such people. And I think the fact that Chris was willing to, even though he himself had radios with keypads and didn't necessarily need to rely on a 77S because so much could be done with the radio with a keypad, the fact that he continued to help along to make sure that the 77S side of things was getting all the love that it needed as well is yet another one of Chris's great contributions to amateur radio, especially for blind people. So thank you for that, Robert. Holly, go ahead.
Good evening. I did not know Chris well, but he was very helpful and very patient, really patient. I think a lot more than I would have been in helping me to get my GD77 firmware, software, whatever the proper term is for it, downloaded and into my GD77, I think S, as I recall the proper name for it. And while I haven't used the radio much at all, his mark was left in it because of what he was able to help me with and teach me, and having the patience that a good teacher should have.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. Did you have anything else, or were you done?
No, I was done. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. I want to make sure. Okay, yeah, I agree. He had extraordinary patience, and I kind of wish that Neil at K8IT was here because he also did a lot of work with Chris, and Chris did a lot of there was a lot of helping going on there as well, and it was just wonderful to just see that going on. Anybody else?
KB6DA.
KB6DA, go ahead.
Yeah, Rob from Sunnyvale, and my first memories of Chris were from the Blind Hams Net on Saturday mornings when I first got into DMR. I didn't have much contact with Chris other than through the net, but I think it was Joel who said his wife really liked Chris's laugh and his voice. My wife was the same. This guy was just a friendly, just a good spirit on the net, and then of course I was impressed with all the help that he was giving other people. Just a real inspiration. I'm clear.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, I agree. My YL over here liked hearing his voice on the radio too. I think he had a whole other fan club beyond the radio. People who just heard him in the background and liked his voice, his laughter, and it's just his overall jolly personality.
Absolutely.
Anybody else want to tell a story?
Give a recheck, Julian.
Yeah, go ahead, Joel.
Chris still holds a couple of records on the Blind Hams group, network, podcast. I think he's, I haven't counted them, but I think he's the largest contributor of podcasts that we have. Plus, he's still, Patrick may correct me, he still holds the record for the most check-ins on a Saturday morning net of 76. when we gave, Neil donated a GD77S, and Chris was lucky enough to be the net control that weekend. We decided to do it, and I think that record still stands. Is that right, Patrick? But I think that's correct, and I don't see that record. We'll always remember him for his couple of records, those check-ins on the Saturday morning net. Oh, one more thing. I was going to wait to the end, but we talked about having an award. We want people to send in an email recommending an Elmer of the Year for the CQ Blind Hams Elmer of the Year Award. We're going to name it the Chris Miller Elmer of the Year Award. So during this year, up until say November, you send in your recommendation for an Elmer, and our group of podcasters will go over it and decide, and then we will be creating a trophy or plaque and sending out to the Elmer of the Year, and the title will be the Chris Miller Elmer of the Year Award. So we're going to start doing that starting next year, but we're taking nominations all year long. Back to you, Julian.
I love that idea, because that was one of the things I was going to say as we were going to wrap things up, is that we should find a way to memorialize him. He needs his name on something, and I can't think of a more fitting thing to have his name on than an award to recognize outstanding contributions in the Elmering department. So very good. I love it. Anybody else want to tell a story, share a memory, something about Chris?
NC5R.
Go ahead, Robert.
A lot of us, I think, certainly me, if I had a problem that I just couldn't figure out, I would usually go to Chris. So those that, most of the time I'm pretty good at this stuff. I can usually figure something out, but sometimes I can't. And so I got myself a new node. It was a clear zero node, and I could not get it to work. I just couldn't get it to work. I mean, it would sort of work, but it wouldn't. I could communicate with the radio inside the node, but I had no internet capability with node, and I tried everything. And so I called Chris on the phone, and he was, as Chris always was 100% engaged in this process. And we worked and we worked and we worked, and we could not figure it out. And finally we got off the phone, and my wife took a look at the clear zero, and she said, "What's this piece of tape here that says power on it?" Well, it turned out that the node had been shipped with a piece of tape covering the port where the power cable was supposed to be plugged into the node. I'd been plugging it into the wrong USB port, because I didn't know there was another one, because it was covered up with a piece of tape. And so we would have never figured this out, Chris and I, no matter how hard we tried. But that's a story that I'll always remember. Back to you, Julian.
Yep, that's a good one. All right. Who would have thought a piece of tape that says power? Oh well. You live and learn. Anybody else?
WB5NFS.
N2DYI.
Okay. WB5NSS, and then Patrick.
Good evening, everybody. I will remember Chris for a lot of reasons. Marvin had started a group on WhatsApp called Amateur Hour, and Chris was one of the first people. And the one thing that Chris did was caused me to laugh a lot, because he and I, as others have shared, had a punny sense of humor. And the one time that we all got together, one of the members' relatives took a cane to both of us and hit us where we shouldn't have been hit, but nonetheless, because he got tired of our puns. But and my wife is still laughing about that. The other thing I will remember Chris for is, and you hear people say that during times like this, but this was the truth. Chris loved his Lord, and he made no secret about that. But it was never forced. He was just generous in all kinds of ways, and he was a confidant. Just a good guy, and he will forever be missed. That's for sure. So that's my brief summary. Oh, the other thing he did was he caused me to be united with people that I admired, and when I first met them, I could hardly talk because these were people I have known about or known of in a distant way for years, and I found out that they were amateur radio operators. So it's really cool. That's all I've got. WB5NFS. Oh, we're not. We're on Zoom. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
We'll take
That's okay. Names and call signs are interchangeable amongst hams. That's for sure. That's for sure. And yeah. Okay. We got some kind of music there going on in the background. Somebody might want to mute themselves. Alrighty, thank you for that. And Patrick, go ahead.
All right. Yeah, somebody a few minutes ago mentioned Chris's net records. That was kind of a funny thing between me and Chris. I'd kind of completely forgotten about that until it was brought up again. We had a little friendly competition going on for a while. I had a record, then he had one, and then I had it again, and we were just going back and forth. Hey, Chris, can you get more check-ins than me this week? Yeah. How about the other way around? It just went back and forth. Never really went anywhere. It was just kind of a friendly thing, and then of course the radio giveaway happened, and the unbeatable record, as far as I'm concerned, happened. I had completely forgotten about that until that brought up. And another thing that I was just reminded of was a silly thing that happened. We were on the bridge one day, and Chris was helping somebody with a node. I can't remember what kind of node it was. I guess it doesn't really matter. But I was there with him, and we were bouncing ideas back and forth, and Chris had conflated the words disconnect and node and came up with the word discanode. And the discanode is the act of disconnecting a node, of course, but we just the way he said it and the way it happened, just everybody busted out for like a minute over discanode. So there's your NE5V word of the day, discanode. Back to you.
All right. I'll never think of Star 76 the same way. Discanode. All right, good stuff. Anybody else?
Enter the line.
Go ahead, Angela.
Just a quick comment. Every time Chris and I talked, and most of the time, I would always ask him, how Claudia was doing. And I got to say, he always spoke about her with such reverence and love that I didn't want this to go by without her knowing that Chris really did love Claudia a lot and always spoke with her highly respectfully. And it made me proud to see somebody like that, because a lot of that's missing today, folks. Back to you, Julian.
That is absolutely true. I always admire couples that speak nicely about each other, in or out of each other's presence. I've always looked at that as a way to sort of, I guess, measure somebody. If they were constantly putting down their spouse or their significant other, it would kind of make you wonder. but when they always speak lovingly, and not just in their words, but in their tone and everything else, that is something. And along those lines, one of the things I want to put in here, and I think I could speak not only for those of us who are here at this conference, but really all of us that are on Blind Hams, or anybody who knew or interacted with Chris on the radio, to a message to Claudia is just to say thank you for sharing him with us. You know, he definitely gave a lot of his time and his effort to this community. And there are some spouses who are not always as understanding of that. And I never got the impression that the time that Chris spent on the radio and helping other hams and such ever was a problem to her, to you. So I just like to say, you know, thank you, Claudia. And again, I think I speak for everybody who was here and everybody who knew Chris on the radio. Thank you for sharing him with us and not giving him a hard time about being on the radio too long or helping us out. That's for sure. All right, let's see. I see that Russ, KF4MLR, just came in here a little late, wondering, not to put you on the spot, but if you had any thoughts or stories or something you wanted to share about Chris, or maybe not. All righty. Anybody else want to share a story, comment, something?
I've got one quick thing.
Yeah, go ahead, Marvin.
Yesterday when I was talking to Claudia, I try to check in with Claudia once a weekish, or you know, thereabouts. And yesterday she brought something to my attention. She said, you know, she said, Chris and I did everything together. And that made me even more, I guess you would say, more fixed on the fact that, you know, I need to keep up my phone calls just to check on Claudia and all that stuff. Because, you know, I think Chris would have appreciated that, you know, somebody was just checking in with her and, you know, for a minute say, hey, how's it going? Somebody told me the other day, we were talking, and I said, you know, the hard part for Claudia is going to be after everybody's gone, after, you know, the funeral services are over and all the things are done. And she brought it to my attention yesterday. She says, you know, the hardest thing is coming home and knowing that she's coming home to that empty house. So everybody keep Claudia in your prayers, because they've been together a good long time. And that's it.
Wow, thank you, Marvin. That one kind of hits home for me a little bit, not to get too into the weeds, but basically I've been where she is. I once lost a spouse as well to cancer, and I've lived exactly what you were just talking about. And one thing I learned is that you absolutely have to reach out to people. You should not be ashamed to ask your friends or loved ones to just call you, even if it's just to say hi, even if it's just to chat for a few minutes. One of the things I did after my loss was to go to support groups that were there to help grieving spouses after that type of loss. And I learned some techniques, some coping techniques, and that was one of them, is to just resist the urge to not ask people for things. And one of the things they suggested that we always ask is that we ask our friends and close ones, loved ones, whoever, you know, just call me every so often. You know, you don't have to worry about having the right thing to say or anything like that. It's just call me just to check in, so that my phone rings. because it's true, after everything's said and done and the services are done and all the relatives and everybody go home, you are left with an empty house. And especially when you've been with somebody that long and you did everything together like that, it is a major adjustment. And I'll just use this opportunity to put this out there. Claudia, I don't know you, but I've been there, and I'm more than happy to be part of a support system for you to lean on and turn to if it helps. You can certainly get that message to Marvin, and Marvin can get a hold of me through my email on QRZ and get that contact going. If it's something that would be helpful, I'd be happy to be part of that. And if not me, then others, others who, and especially someone who knew both of you. Talk to people, keep people in your life. But eventually, eventually it gets a little easier and easier. But right now, I understand it's overwhelming. But don't be ashamed to ask people to help, even if it's just to ring your phone every couple of days, just
Julian
to say hi,
Vargas.
just so that you have phone calls coming in. So I'll leave it at that. Anybody else want to add something? Okay. Hearing none, then we'll go ahead and wrap this up. I want to thank you all for being here, for contributing to this wonderful conversation, and again, just for something that lets Claudia know just how much Chris was loved and admired by this community that he gave so much to. So that's about it. 7-3 to all.
Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast and visit www.blindhams.com.